Why
day
haven't
after
you done
account.
that, Joe? Honestly, what's wrong, mate?
It's because I haven't
Shocking.
worked. I haven't
Shocking.
worked out.
Sort it out, bruv.
I haven't worked.
Are you even accountable to our listeners or not?
Yeah,
What is
what
wrong
you
with
doing?
you, Joe?
I don't know, man. I don't know. Punish me.
Hello and welcome to this week's Live for the Party, a deep dive into everything to do with left-wing parties and political organising in Britain. I'm your host, Jonas Marvin, and I'm here with my friends and comrades, Shanice McBean.
Hello.
And Joe Todd.
Hello.
Just before we start, we love your feedback, so never refrain from leaving us a comment on Spotify, Apple, or dropping us an email on podlivefortheparty@gmail.com. This week, we're going to kick things off with a little deep dive into the kind of rupturous local elections. Joe, kick us off.
Yeah, so we are recording this on Saturday, 9th of May, so it is the day after most of the local election results. I think some might still be coming in, but most of them have come in. And I am tired and smelly and hungover because I was at the town for Haringey. Full disclosure, my housemate was one of the councillors who was elected in Haringey. Green councillor was elected in Haringey last night. And yeah, it was a big night across the country for Reform and the Greens. The main top line story is that there were just like tons of Labour losses, 1,406 by my count at time of recording to Reform's 1,442 gains.
Wow, that's funny.
But I think so. Yeah, the top line story is just that, like, you know, Reform have done very well in areas that you would expect across the country, and if the vote share that is implied, there's been different implied vote shares, but if the vote share that is implied from these local elections came to be the case at general election, you'd be seeing a Reform government, maybe with some support from the Tories, but you'd be seeing a Reform government. Yeah, so that, you know, the overall story is that Reform have really smashed it, and there are loads of implications from that. I think in this introduction, I am going to focus on the left-wing parties and on the Green Party because, you know, we are a podcast about building left-wing parties and left-wing politics, and I think you'd say it was a decent to good night for the Greens and a pretty bad night for your party and Associated Independents. The Greens got 374 seats at the time of recording. This is a little bit below some estimations. People were putting them roughly at 400, 500, 600, and we can explain that a little bit in a minute. But they did have some quite spectacular wins. They got the mayoralties over the line in Hackney and in Lewisham. They took Norwich City Council, Hastings Council, Council of Waltham Forest, going from 0 to 35 councillors, which is like unprecedented and crazy. I don't think anyone was expecting that. Lewisham looks set to become a Green Council, I think, but I don't think that's announced yet. And Haringey, North London, which is where I was, went in overall control, and there's likely to be a Green minority administration in Haringey. There were also really big gains in Manchester, Sheffield, Huddersfield, Newcastle, and other kind of like small and large urban centres across the country. You'd say that independents did decently in Birmingham. They were like pro-Gaza independents in Birmingham. There were the Newham independents, which were quite heavily backed by Corbyn. They did quite well in Newham too. There was some in Redbridge, some in Walsall, some in Blackburn. But I think the story on the left really was like, you know, quite big, spectacular gains, at least in terms of the councils and the mayoralties, if not in terms of the number of seats. I mean, coming to that number of seats, it just looks like that the Green vote was quite inefficient. The Greens gained some in many places across the country and edged into like third or second. And a big story that's been told, which I think is true as far as I can tell, is that Labour lost lots of seats to Reform because the Greens were hurting them. You know, so it's not like you've got a straight transfer of votes from Labour to Reform, and that's why Reform are winning all these former Labour councils. It's actually that a decent chunk of those votes are going to the Greens. The Greens don't win seats because they just end up in second and third, but it pushes Labour down, and you end up with Reform councillors coming through. And that just has a lot of implications and a lot of questions for what these two parties, Labour and Greens, are going to do at the next general election, what kind of electoral coordination they can achieve or not if their leaderships are more in alignment than they are now. Because obviously this, you know, what Liberals would more call the like progressive bloc is badly organised at the moment, and the votes are not being efficiently spread, as it were. I think another thing that I'd say as well, and I'm going to zoom in on Haringey here because I'm biased and I live here and I fucking love it. Is that it's clear now? I think that I mean, we've been banging on this drum for a while, but like it's clear that although the Greens, they're an urban party. I think it's fair to say at the moment, like the gains are in urban areas, some larger, some smaller, but like mostly urban areas. But it's not the same as saying that they're like a white middle class liberal party. And I'll use the example of Haringey. So Haringey is a big borough in North London. It includes David Lammy's seat, Catherine West's seat, and there's really two halves to it. There's a train track that runs north to south, right up the middle along a street called Green Lanes, and to the east you've got some of the most deprived boroughs in the whole of London. Like White Hart Lane, for instance. Like I think it's like the fourth most deprived borough in the whole of London. You've got Northumberland Park, you've got Tottenham Central, which is where David Lammy used to be a councillor. You've got West Green, you've got Bruce Castle. And then in the west, you've got places like Muswell Hill and Highgate, where if you're not a Londoner, these are like incredibly leafy, very wealthy. These wards border onto Hampstead Heath. You know what I mean? They're like Gales all the way. Gales might be even a bit common for these places. You know what I mean? And the map of Haringey now by council is basically the Greens have dominated in the east or split boroughs in the east with Labour, and then it is Labour and the Liberals fighting for the basically rich bit in the west. And this is just not what anybody thought could happen with the former composition of the Green Party, and it was not the kind of like the idea of what the Green Party could be. And just to highlight some of them, like White Hart Lane, we won 2 councillors from Labour. As I say, I think the fourth most deprived borough in London. We didn't even campaign there. We didn't even knock doors. Didn't even knock doors, and still won 2 of those. Won one in West Green. This wonderful woman called Anne, she's now a councillor here. I think she's in her 70s. Didn't knock a single door, and she beat the Labour candidates by 1,000 votes each. And these are some of the most like mixed and deprived boroughs in the entirety of London. So I think it really does put paid to the idea that the Greens can't be a multiracial working class, middle class party of the cities. Like I think they can definitely do that, and they are doing that. I think one of the other conclusions that I took from it just showed that the organisation of the Greens is quite patchy, and there are just places where the Greens won a lot of votes, like they won the popular vote in Reading, for instance, but that didn't translate into seats. I know Walthamstow and Haringey had very well organised campaigns, but there will be other London boroughs not named that had far less well organised campaigns, and actually not many people turning out to canvass because the local party was quite disorganised. And it is definitely the case that if the Greens are going to translate some of this popularity into actually winning seats, they're going to need better levels of organisation for sure. So yeah, I think that'll be my intro on the council elections. And then obviously we can't finish this without talking about the Senedd elections in Wales. It's Plaid Cymru who have come through as the largest party, benefiting from, I think, like a strong anti-reform vote. It was seen as either like Plaid or Reform going into this, but they are 6 short of a majority. So they've not won a majority there. The Greens have 2. I think it's probably likely that the Greens are going to support them in some way, but they will have to rely, I think, on Liberal Democrat or some Labour MPs to pass legislation.
Amazing. Thank you, Joe. I mean, yeah, the second highest rise in seats behind this Reform UK juggernaut. I mean, it's that kind of thing that we talk about quite a lot of, like Reform and Green being the new Labour versus Tory contest. It's really like kind of borne out here. I mean, it's like really interesting to me in lots of ways, right? We didn't talk that much about Scotland, and I think we should do an episode about Scotland in the future, right? In Scotland, the Greens, who have a much patchier history than the English Greens, went from 8 to 13 seats in the Scottish Parliament. But there's just loads of stuff that really stands out to me here. I mean, in Lewisham, the mayor, Leon Srivastava, is a really interesting guy. I mean, he ran an incredible campaign. This is someone that used to be involved with the Institute for Race Relations, the organisation that was once home to the late black Marxist Balavana Sivanandan. And someone shared an anecdote online that I saw from an election count where a paper candidate wins the ward seat, is completely blown away, did not expect it, and has a load of Greens sat around them reassuring them that they'll do a great job. Do you know what I mean? Kind of profound.
Mate, that happened a lot. I mean, naming no names. There was one councillor at our count who was planning to retire to Spain and is now not going to do that. they're now not going to do that.
Bless them. I mean, there's an interesting thing here, I think, about like, you know, kind of observing it not as a Green Party member, about like to what extent the Greens are doing really well in a really organized and really profound sense in places where the kind of revolution within the party branch has been the deepest, right? Where the transformation of the party branch has been the deepest. And especially with a kind of prioritization of kind of not leafy suburbs, but of multiracial working class communities and trying to reach out to them, right? And there's this other question of like you kind of talked about, Joe, about the kind of, you know, because in lots of places before the kind of Polanski wave, there were loads of Green branches that were dormant that are now aren't dormant, and then they're having to try and run an election and set up a party branch on the fly. Like that's the kind of situation we have in Newcastle on the Lyme, right? And credit to the Greens locally, because they've done an amazing job of trying to balance those things in quite a tough environment, right? The Greens kind of a very marginalised political force. The left is a very marginalised political force in a place like Newcastle on the Lyme, but like to try and balance that kind of, you know, how do you craft a get out the vote machine when you're also trying to develop a branch, and how do you make those things work for each other, often against parties that have sophisticated get out the vote machines is a challenge. I mean, one question I have is like, to what extent, you know, in some places where the Greens have chosen not to encroach into poorer working class areas, multiracial areas, and win votes there, not like realizing the kind of gravity of the transformation underway in British politics, right? The possibilities of kind of building beyond the kind of what might be a kind of already existing comfortable middle class base and moving out towards a kind of broader working class base, even though the election will prove, you know, the election result proves that this is something that you can totally do, and that Green branches up and down the country, particularly in London, are doing it with some success. I guess it's worth talking a bit about the question of reform. I mean, I just want to kind of maybe caveat something you said there, Joe, which I mean, I had a look at some of the work of Luke Trill from the More in Common think tank, kind of psephologist and all of that. And it does seem that there were some Labour to reform switches in places like Wigan, Greater Manchester. Of course, the kind of bigger headline story is probably the kind of split in the left vote, or the centre-left, centrist left vote, that kind of progressive majority that people talk about. But it does seem that there were kind of direct switches in the Northwest in particular. And, you know, there's kind of this question, right? Reform did well in places that voted Leave in 2016 as well, you know, and if that kind of, you know, I worry, you know, that does increase the likelihood of a right-wing coalition in 2029. It's not necessarily the same as a right-wing bloc, you know. Like in 2025, I argued that Reform had a strong chance of winning the majority in the country. Like I remember writing on Substack that it's probably where we first came across each other and started chatting to each other, right? And over the past 6 months, I've kind of backed away from that claim, you know. Reform had kind of seemingly hit a ceiling despite topping the polls, and it seemed their kind of endorsement of the Iran war, the embrace of all of these ex-Tories, they're kind of distancing themselves from some of their more leftwards policies around benefits, around reindustrialization, around work, had kind of limited their appeal. But I think we have to revisit that assumption now. And, you know, we have to revisit on the basis that in large parts of post-industrial England and Wales, Reform UK are winning and competing and coalescing a kind of deep-seated anti-elitist sentiment under their reactionary banner. And it's worrying. You know, it's not totally clear-cut. You have places where, you know, in Great Yarmouth, Reform does well among the kind of traditional petty bourgeois base. In Newcastle under Lyme, down the road from me, where they've won the borough council, they do incredibly well amongst the rural and wealthy. But it is clear to me that there is also deep kind of penetration amongst people that you would kind of discern as our people, right? Working class people. And that is a concern for our side. And then there's the kind of question of like Greater Manchester. I mean, Labour lost its decades-long majority in Thames side. You know, 1/3 of seats are up for election. Reform wins 18 out of 19 seats in the poll. In Wigan, Reform won 24 of 25 seats available, 13 of 21 in Salford, despite Labour holding on to the majority there. So there is this kind of question about whether the progressive vote has split in places like Thames side between Greens and Labour, which means Reform can come through from the middle and benefit from it. You have a kind of different story in a place like Wandsworth, right? The Labour administration, with remarkable individuals like Ivan Dickadum, who has been in charge of housing and introducing some really incredible reforms in the local area, kind of shifting the kind of spatial politics of the area in a leftwards direction in like really quite profound ways, but loses out to this kind of phenomenon that we're talking about, right? As well as this kind of just basic, profound thing that you cannot escape national politics sometimes, right? He kind of talked about this in a social media post, like, the complete failure of the National Labour Party and their complete disregard for their kind of large left-wing city-based voter just kind of is paying its dues for the Labour Party now. And I guess one of the big questions I have coming from all of this is like, there's a big battle for interpretation over who will be best placed to stop reform. The government is in disarray. It doesn't feel like anybody is prepared at the moment, at least at the time of recording. Who knows what happens in the next couple of days to fire the kind of starting gun on toppling Starmer. There's a kind of large contingent of people who want to hold off so that Andy Burnham can kind of get a seat and become the leader of the Labour Party. But then there's also lots of Labour MPs now who are like, what the fuck? We can't keep on like this. This is a disaster. What do we do? And so, like, as much as it pains me to say this, I do think a lot of what happens now over the next couple of years does hinge on what happens in Labour over the next few months.
I guess for me, one of the things that stood out from what you said, Joe, was how the Greens have really made advances in how Jonas phrased it, places where our people live, working class people in particular, diverse racialized communities in urban areas. And I think this is a brilliant thing because you can almost feel that stereotype of the tree-hugging middle-class environmentalist living in the leafy suburbs starting to trickle away. And I do think that, the Greens are entering compositionally, both in terms of who's in their party and who is in their electorate. They're entering a new era. And so the possibilities are vast. At the same time, I think it would be interesting to see how this interacts with what is coming from the media and the political establishment externally in terms of real attempts to try to split the Greens coalition between its core older members and its newer members. And so the construction that I've started to see in the media is, I really liked the Green Party when it was the tree-hugging environmentalists, and I don't like the Green Party now because it's the anti-Semitic Palestine radicals. And you can see this construction starting to be created and cemented in the kind of political class. And although obviously this is propaganda and although obviously it is kind of ideological maneuvering at the expense of the Green Party, some of these stereotypes of the Green Party, of it being tree-hugging and middle-class environmentalists, do represent a compositional reality of historically what the Green Party has represented. And I think the Greens have to, on the one hand, be comfortable with losing some of its old guard. And as it enters this kind of new phase of more socialist leaning, more radical politics, that's going to be the kind of calculation I'm sure Zach Blansky's made. Some people will peel away and kind of not be down for that. And actually, they did lose a chunk of their councils and councillors that they were defending. And that's not a huge story because Reform lost a significant chunk of the councils and councillors they were defending as well as making gains. But it's not irrelevant. But while that is a reality, I think the Greens do need to be careful not to allow their internal coalition to be split down the middle and for them to completely subsume their politics and identity into a Corbynism Mark II and actually lose some of the good things that are unique about the Greens' history and the Greens' identity as the Greens. And that's not because, I believe in the Greens as an institution. Obviously, I'm a Marxist, I'm a socialist, I'm a revolutionary. It's not the organization for me. But I think their momentum could be massively damaged by a split between kind of their newer members and their newer politics and their older members and their kind of more established ways of doing things. And so, yeah, I think shedding the stereotype of being a party of the middle class is great. And I think now this raises the question, how does the Green Party hold its own coalition together? And I think that's important because it will ultimately make the party more robust in the face of the external attacks that are coming to it.
For sure. I think that's completely true. And I think just another example from Haringey, like I emphasised the recomposition of the party in the east of the borough, which I think has been a very deliberate choice. But the votes in the west of the borough, where we didn't campaign this time, were really interesting. Like we gained a councillor in Highgate, despite, not campaigning there at all.
Yeah, I saw that. It's pretty mad.
Yeah. We put up really, really, really strong votes in Alexandra Park. I can't remember a couple of others, but we weren't absent from there at all. And I think one of the most interesting things for me was some extrapolated, and they are extrapolated, but extrapolated vote figures for the constituencies based on these local elections. So extrapolated vote figures for David Lammy's constituency, which is Tottenham, which is, the east of Haringey. And then for Catherine West's seat in the west of the borough, including, some of the posher areas like Alexandra Park, Crouch End, Hornsey, Muswell Hill. And, with Lammy in Tottenham, they had the Greens 10,000 votes ahead of Labour. And in the West, in Catherine West's seat, it was basically a three-way tie between the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, and Labour. So this is just kind of to say that, I think, at least zoomed in on a Haringey level, if we're going to use both what I know is the kind of membership of the party and the composition of the party, but also what the vote looks like from this local election, I think they're probably doing quite a good job of holding that constituency together. I know people in the campaign were very worried that the attacks on Zach regarding anti-Semitism and some of the mistakes that he may have made over the last 2 weeks would come back to bite them. And it did come up more on the door in the west of the borough. It basically didn't come up at all in the east. Did come up more in the west with, people with big semi-detached houses that read The Guardian every morning, those kind of people. But the vote totals were still pretty amazing. They were still pretty amazing. Maybe they could have been better, but they were still pretty amazing.
I'm even looking at Crouch End now, which is an area that has a stereotype of being that, leafy suburb, middle-class area. Yeah. And actually the Greens are just hundreds of votes behind the Lib Dems who won, and then Labour's in the middle. So actually we're not talking about these vast gaps between these cohorts of people, actually.
Yeah, so close. And I really can't look. I haven't looked at all of the election results from across the entire country because that would be an insane thing to do in 2 hours sleep.
Why haven't you done that, Joe? Honestly, what's wrong, mate?
It's because I haven't worked. I haven't worked out.
Sort it out, bruv.
I haven't worked.
Are you even accountable to our listeners or not?
Yeah,
what is wrong with you, Joe?
I don't know. I don't know. Punish me. But I haven't done that. But look, at a Haringey level, it does actually feel like they're keeping that coalition together really well. And we can talk about governing if you want, and we can talk about what these councils might actually do. And obviously, I've said on this podcast a long time that I'm wary of the Greens taking councils if they could avoid it, because there's a slight worry about how it'll impact the national project. But yeah, and obviously governing will be trying to keep that coalition together, and it'll mean doing a mixture of active travel stuff and planting lots of trees. I'm sure if they go for it, putting cycle lanes on green lanes will be an incredibly controversial thing to do. And then also just a lot of the more working class focused organising and cost of living stuff. I mean, I was looking through some of the manifestos before this podcast, and take Hackney. Hackney's got some really interesting stuff in the manifesto around establishing tenants and residents associations in every estate, establishing food co-ops in every estate, phasing out use of bailiffs to collect council tax debt, enabling residents to access affordable credit by partnering with a credit union as a council. Haringey is planning to do lots of stuff around what are called popular asset commissions and public common partnerships. So these are ideas pushed by a lefty think tank called Abundance, and they basically seek to invert the old private public partnership model where your council has a contract with a private contractor, and the private contractor basically just creams off loads of profit for them, the council, and acts as a rent seeker. And the council is meant to go through a process of basically auditing all of the things that the council does that are of this ilk. So basically auditing and making it transparent. So you say to the people look, we've just got in, and your previous administration has literally been spending all of this money on private companies who have been, taking your money and basically taking it for profit. And what we're going to do is that we're going to instead have those partnerships with community groups and, you know, like local businesses that are in the area or whatever. And we're going to try and run that in a relatively democratic way where residents are involved in the apportioning of that money at like a ward level that then goes up to a borough level. It gets quite technical. I'm not going to explain it all here, but there is some really interesting stuff there, which it's like, what does it mean for socialists to go into local government, and what does it mean for socialists to try and have what they're called like a transitional council, you know, like a council that can change citizens' view of their relationship to the state, but also the relationship to themselves as well. And yeah, it's interesting. It's definitely interesting. I see the massive pitfalls of them running these councils, but there are interesting stuff going on.
I agree with you, Joe, and I'd add, jubilation aside, because I'm sure the Greens are very excited and very thrilled with the gains that they made. I actually think now is where the danger zone begins, because very, very easily the image of the Greens being insurgent, outsiders to the political system who are kind of challenging the establishment and offering alternatives, that could really be tarnished by going into councils now with majorities or significant minorities and simply trying to do what Labour did and manage these fundamental contradictions and manage a crisis. And actually, they've got to start finding ways to convert what are election wins to local grassroots mass power that can build and build and build. Or I don't think that's necessarily a councillor's responsibility, but they need to be part of processes that are building so that we can, I think, you know, fundamentally challenge the status quo. And I think that means taking on, rather than a managerial approach, for example, a campaigning approach to being in a council or being a councillor, where you are instituting kind of tangible wins, you know, similar to Zoran Mamdani, that actually have, you know, an impact on people's lives, like the potholes, for example, where you're, you know, couching this in kind of really slick local and national media to communicate to people like, look, here are the things we're doing, here are the things we can't do because of national government, etc. But I also think they have to get really creative and bold. And so my friend Avia, who I wrote Abolition Revolution with, told me a story from the Poplar Rates Rebellion in the 1920s that I think, I'm not saying that Green councillors need to now do exactly what they did in Poplar in 1920, but what I'm saying is we need to get creative. So what happened in 1920, a bunch of working class and socialist, in 1921, sorry, a bunch of working class and socialist councillors took over Poplar Council. And Poplar was extremely working class, extremely poor at that time. But because of its location to the centre, to the city, it had to pay really high precepts and really high rates to local government. So it meant it was extremely poor. It had no money to kind of do the kind of social transformation that it wanted to do. And at the same time, it had to pay lots of its money out to central government. So what these socialists did, they were like, do you know what? Bun that. We're going to bring in new social measures like equal pay for women, like massive wage increases for local workers, you know, different kind of social measures around food, around housing. And then they paid for it by refusing to pay central government the precepts and the rates that they owed central government. And this led to them then being accused of contempt. They were charged, they were arrested, and they were put in prison, and they were doing the business of organizing the council from prison. So they were holding council meetings and they were administering council business from prison. And it was deeply embarrassing for the government. And obviously it meant that they were able to push tangible, meaningful, serious improvements to people's lives, whilst also fundamentally challenging the status quo and not just trying to manage contradiction and crisis, but actually fundamentally shifting something similar to the poll tax, right? You're not just simply trying to skirt around an issue, you're trying to reconfigure class relationships. And so I think that's the kind of creativity, the kind of boldness, the kind of radicalism councillors who are serious about the project of social transformation need to go into these councils. That's the mindset they need to go in with. You know, what are the creative, What are the status quo breaking things that we can do to fundamentally challenge the neoliberal crisis that we're in? And I think that is really the mindset that they need.
I definitely think we're going to get some of that, but I think that if we're going to reach for historical examples, they're probably going to be looking at examples more like the Greater London Council than they will be like rates rebellions and stuff. And I think, and we can argue as to whether that's right or wrong. I think it comes down to an approach to the state which is more deliverist, more kind of Mamdani like, I suppose. Like we want to get in and like change the structures of stuff, but we also want to like make people's lives better and be seen as like people who are actually able to do that and competent, as opposed to this more combative approach where it's like, oh, you take state power at a level and then you use that to kick off a higher degree of struggle and crisis. And I'm not trying to argue for one or the other, because I feel myself, veer between those two different positions all of the time, depending on the specific situation we're talking about. But I get the impression that from these Green councils I've got in, there'll be a lot more kind of like, how can we use local government to deliver better for working class people, and also how can we use local government to stimulate and organize the community and associational life and increase levels of community power. So that simple example of Hackney supporting tenants associations and food co-ops on every estate. How can we use the council and use the state to like increase the power of community in civil society? I think that's probably going to be more of the orientation, I think.
Yeah, I hear that. But I guess the thing that was interesting about the popular rates rebellion is it did both. So it really did tangibly improve people's lives, equal pay for women, improving, the wages of workers locally, improving the conditions of housing. And then also it challenged class relations in Poplar as well. Now it meant that some people ended up in prison. So I can imagine that not being something the Greens want to take on. But the Poplar Rebellion did do both of those things.
Yeah, and maybe, again, to just caveat what I said, and, apologies to listeners around the country, I am referencing Haringey a lot, but it's just because I'm in deep in the detail. It's not because I'm incredibly biased. But, in Haringey, there is this sense that, there'll be this part of the agenda where they try and build community power using the state and, deliver for working class people. But there's also a combative element, and the combative element will be towards Tottenham Hotspur. Sadly,
Whoop!
I say as a Tottenham Hotspur fan on a podcast with two Arsenal fans, but it'd be towards Spurs, who are basically built, one of the most magnificent stadiums in the world in an incredibly poor part of the borough.
This is gross.
Magnificent,
incredibly poor.
Great stage for Beyonce.
Well, yeah, but this is precisely the problem. So, incredible stadium in a really poor part of the borough, which sees, but football fans, NFL fans, music fans.
Mate, I went to watch Conor Benn versus Chris Eubank Jr. there. So yeah.
Oh mate, but I just, what I mean, like everyone goes there, and basically the residents who live around the stadium suffer because like it costs loads to police. There's just like loads of people there all the time, and the club have promised to put loads of money into the local area, and they just never do. You know what I mean? And the Labour Council just like really haven't held them to it. So I think that it's not against the state, but like that will probably be one of the more kind of like combative elements of their programme, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they'll hope that Tottenham don't get relegated so that they can actually get some of that money from them.
Mate, that came up a few times at the count. That came up a few times at the count, not gonna lie.
There's a kind of, we haven't talked about Birmingham, right? Like, reform wins slightly, but just really a profound marker of the kind of fragmented nature of politics in the country at the minute, right? Like the no overall control Britain. That I feel that might catch. Do you know what I mean? Like no overall control. Who feels control over their lives? Who actually gets control over the councils? Like politics is so fragmented at the minute that it's just remarkable that it's difficult to imagine political actors reproducing the system as it is in lots of ways, right? And I think in that context, as well as with the fact that like, the Greens have won in a bunch of places. There's this kind of the challenge of escaping that tunnel vision that kind of can emerge when you're in the kind of apparatus of the state. But like in that context of like no overall control, that sense of decline that people feel, like there's a strong temptation towards deliverism, right? People talk about it quite a bit. And I think, to my mind at least, I think that conditions like a bit of like the radicalism of these kind of municipal politics alongside like, when I say the radicalism, I mean the kind of confrontational radicalism that kind of Shanice illustrates with the popular rebellion, as opposed to a kind of delivery radicalism. Like I think that kind of mediates things quite a bit, and I think we have to take that into consideration. And I probably say this every episode now, but I think it's really important. That's why you can that's why you kind of conceptualize two different groups or multiple different groups of people doing different things, right? Because actually, like if you're organizing in your community or you're a lefty and you're not a Green Party member, like you want to have some political independence, right? You don't necessarily want your organizing priorities to be an appendage to people who are in control of the council, right? You want some independence from that. But you do also want a relationship, right? And that's kind of the thing that people are going to have to figure out, right? Is how can you be on the left, manage a council like this, do good stuff, do transformative stuff potentially, have a relationship with people who are doing organizing there. Like the latest episode of The Dig, for example, I really recommend people listen to it. It's terrific about the relationship between organizations like Kava and Drumbeats to the Mamdani administration and some of the tensions there and the way that those organizations have had to work through those tensions with the administration, sometimes in generative, productive ways and sometimes in antagonistic ways. But I think it really highlights the need, in my opinion, for a kind of division of labor on the left, right? If we're in a situation where we're approaching electoral success and entering capitalist institutions. There's this kind of other question for me, which is kind of gets to a thing about the kind of, I guess, compositional, coalitional problems, challenges ahead for Polanski's project, for the Greens project going forward. And that is this question of like, do we want a majoritarian politics or not across the country, right? That's the question that I think is going to be posing itself pretty sharply now. And I have it in my head, right? I'm always kind of worried, like, that moment between 2017 and 2019 with Jeremy Corbyn, where he turns from a kind of radical outsider into a politician in lots of people's eyes, right? And how that's navigated. And I just, we're looking down the barrel of the possibility of a kind of hard right, reform-led coalition versus if Andy Burnham gets on the ticket, for example, a soft left Labour Green coalition potentially. And the big benefit for that, lots of ifs that get you there, right? But the big benefit of that is it stops reform getting into power. And I don't think that should be underestimated. But it also creates all kinds of problems for the Polanski project, both for the next general election and the one after, right? If the Greens are not a majoritarian project, and if they don't conceptualize themselves as one kind of beyond a single electoral cycle, if they're happy with a kind of arrangement with a Burnham-led Labour Party, I worry about that. I was chatting to my friend Johnny yesterday, and he kind of said to me, it was only a few years ago when De Linke essentially ran on the platform of, we will be the junior party of the SPD to keep them left, and got a total drubbing, right? Or 20 years ago, a little bit longer than 20 years ago now. No, actually 20 years ago when Bertinotti takes Rifondazione Comunista into coalition with the Italian centre-left and kind of wipes out the organisation as a serious force, right? So there are real kind of questions for the Greens there. And I don't want to take things for granted. Like a lot of this is based on Andy Burnham if he's the leader, and there's nothing guaranteed about that, right? Labour have been shattered in the Northwest in lots of ways in the recent election. It will be hard for Burnham to win a seat, let alone become Labour leader and PM. It does really feel to me like he is their last hope, the Labour Party, especially when you see his favourability ratings amongst reform voters compared with other prospective Labour leaders. And that kind of challenge poses huge questions to the Green Party going forward, alongside all of the kind of questions that you guys have quite eloquently talked about.
Jonas, it's just completely unreasonable because you can't bring up such a big topic right at the end of the season. It's just not It's just not a legitimate thing to do.
Listen, mate, you've been
We could probably talk about that. We could probably talk about that for 3 hours.
Onwards to our first 2-hour episode.
3 hours. We said that we would keep this episode to 1.5 hours. We're on 44 minutes. I've written down about 8 things that I want to respond to there. I'm not talking about Burnham because we're going to talk about Burnham, but I'm not going to talk about Burnham. I'm just going to bring it back to local. I'm going to bring it back to the local elections and local councils. Like, I think that you're completely right, Jonas. With those possible trajectories of the Green project, it's really important that the left, especially people that might not feel comfortable in the Greens or doing electoralism, are doing organising and building power outside of it. But I think it is just really important to, understand that sometimes you'll be in an antagonistic posture towards the Greens, sometimes you'll be in a collaborative one. And just a really obvious concrete example of this is my mates talking about setting up a worker centre in London somewhere. And I was like, oh, how are you going to get the space? And he's like, well, hopefully the Greens will win the council and then I can negotiate a really, like a peppercorn rent with them and then we'll be able to get a space from them. It's that kind of thing.
Yeah, totally.
Like it sounds really simple, but it's that kind of thing where you can have like good collaborative relationships between Green councils and radicals that want to do stuff but might not be able to do stuff without a bit of support or space or whatever.
Thanks for the news, Joe. We want to go straight on to our hot take. Shanice, you're up this week. Give it to us.
I am indeed. So this is a huge topic. It is anti-Semitism. And the Greens have been coming under huge fire on anti-Semitism, very reminiscent to the Corbyn experience. And I think in order to find our way through this current moment of both rising anti-Semitism and a rising moral panic about anti-Semitism, we actually have to have our own analysis of what anti-Semitism is and where it comes from and make strategic decisions and make political decisions from there. And just to clarify, by moral panic, I don't mean outrage. I think if we're not outraged by injustices against Jews, then our moral compass is pointing in the wrong direction, quite frankly. But how I mean moral panic is as an analytical term, adapted from Stuart Hall's work, where the state uses real things, real events that are happening, but narrates them through its own interests and its own self-preservation, and narrates them against those it defines as its enemies. So in this case, Muslims, in the case in Britain, Muslims who are perceived to be the West's adversaries internationally, and then the left, who are the West's adversaries domestically. So, okay, let's rewind several centuries now. What is anti-Semitism? The first thing to say is, contrary to the narrative that you'll get in the media at the moment, which focuses on anti-Semitism as if it's an invention of the Muslim world, anti-Semitism is a Christian European invention. And one particularly potent way it was instrumentalized in Western Europe, and England led the pack here, was to position Jews socially, ideologically, and structurally as a hated minority. And they did this in a couple of ways. I mean, they did this in loads of ways, but the 2 ways that I want to talk about are, firstly, they did it through creating anti-Semitic mythologies, and those were used as propaganda in the dominant institutions, so particularly the Treasury, the judiciary, and the church. They were the main culprits, and they absolutely loved using anti-Semitic propaganda as currency. But the other way was material. So it wasn't just ideological, it was also structural, it was also material, through usury. So for those of you who don't know, usury was money lending and debt collection. And it, as a profession, it was instrumental to the medieval economy and instrumental to preserving the English ruling monarchy. And Jews were actually forced into those jobs because they were discriminated against in other professions. And also, conveniently, Christians were banned from usury as a profession. So 2 things are salient here. First, the profession, usury, debt collection, money lending, it was absolutely loathed by the subordinate classes. And the subordinate classes viewed it, they viewed a straight line between money lending, debt collection, and their own poverty. So that's the first thing. But also, alongside this, despite the exclusion of Jews from the ruling class, which was absolutely real, Jews were fundamentally not allowed to be part of the ruling elite, not allowed to be part of the aristocracy. At the same time, Jews could accumulate some collective wealth through usury. And this was useful to the ruling elite. Why? Because first of all, a quick anti-Semitic pogrom instigated by the Christian ruling class or the aristocracy, and the treasury could expel Jews, seize their wealth, and they'd get a quick cash injection during a political or during an economic crisis. So it was useful from that perspective. And alongside this, you also had classic divide and rule. So the ruling elite could and often did point to very limited Jewish wealth and say, aha, there it is. That's the rationale for mass agonizing poverty. There's your problem. It was classic divide and rule. So why do I go back to the medieval period? Because it illustrates how anti-Jewish racism, like all racisms, are a technology of power and control, right? It always has been. Newer racisms, like colonial racisms that emerge out of empire, like anti-Black racism that emerged out of chattel slavery, they were all modeled on anti-Semitism. They expanded anti-Semitism. They were modeled on it. And so there was this famous racist phrase several hundred years ago, is the despised blood of the Negro flows freely in the veins of Jews. You know, this idea that Black people and Jews, bottom of the barrel, scum of the earth, they're all the same. So structural anti-Semitism expressed through ruling institutions both creates the conditions of possibility and ferments anti-Semitism from below. Whenever you have anti-Semitism from below, you always need to look at the elites and say, okay, hang on, what's going on there? So hold on to this idea. Anti-Semitism from below and above are always symbiotic. And all the way up into the Holocaust, people were encouraged to reach for anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, to rationalize and make sense of a chaotic, violent, oppressive world. You know, if a kid died, Jews killed him. If there's a plague, the Jews spread it. If you've got no money, Jews took it. So how does this history relate to our current moment? I would argue that there are several meaningful and important continuities between what I call classical anti-Semitism and what we're seeing play out today, particularly in how Jews are positioned and politically instrumentalized by the ruling elite. And as the world burns generally and the West declines specifically, I'm seeing the masses being encouraged to look for explanations, and one answer that they're being given over and over again is the Jews. So when we're looking at anti-Semitism from below and the street level, we have to ask what's happening within the state. So let's break that down. At the same time that Jews are being stabbed and killed and swastika graffiti becomes more commonplace, I saw it at a bus stop, literally on West Green Road the other day, as Jewish buildings are being burned, on the elite side, the police and government are lining up behind a historic and draconian curbing of our civil liberties to protest and assemble. Why? Supposedly to protect Jews, despite it being the fact that they wanted to do this for a long time. Look at BLM and how they tried to use COVID to curb our right to protest and our right to assemble then. Now they're using the Jews. At the same time that there is both domestic and international contestation of the West's imperial dominance, democratic legitimacy, and moral superiority, who is being invoked as the symbolic face of Western values? Jewish people. Who is being mobilized as the ideological ballast and cover for anti-migrant policies? Well, on the one hand, it's women. If you look at how Reform and Restore position anti-migrant policies, it's often to protect our women, protect our girls. But also Jews. Again, you know, we're seeing we're seeing Labour politicians argue that we have to cut down on Muslim migration because Muslims are savage anti-Semites. Who is being used as the face currently by the Metropolitan Police to campaign for greater permanent funding for the Metropolitan Police? Just after, by the way, a couple of years ago, the Met Police were put on notice for institutional racism by the Lord Casey report and institutional misogyny and homophobia. Who's now being used as the campaign face for more funding to this institution? Jews. Who's being held up as the modern minority against which Muslims, Black people, and other racial minorities are maligned? Jews? Who's being used to minimize the reality of racism against Black people, against Muslims, against migrants? Again, Jews. This week, Kemi Badenoch flatly denied that the existence of violent Islamophobia on our streets, and declared Tommy Robinson's Unite the Kingdom march to be less of an issue for racial harmony than Palestine solidarity marches, even though on these marches they shout, "Sink the boats," "Who the F is Allah," and other anti-Muslim chants. And the week before that, she said this country takes anti-Black racism seriously, but not anti-Semitism. And Mark Rowley, after the Golders Green attack, said no other community in Britain has to fear walking the streets like Jews do. I would like to see him tell that to the face of the Sikh woman who was raped for being mistaken for a Muslim, or the 9-year-old girl who was shot with a BB gun in Bristol while racist epithets were shouted at her. And all the while, I've missed out the key bit, which is these people are laundering Jewish identity to defend a televised genocide that we can all see with our own eyes by aggressively conflating Jews with Israel, collapsing Judaism, which is a religion, into Zionism, which is an ethno-nationalist political movement, and propagating the idea that Israel speaks for all Jews everywhere at all times. So is it any wonder in this context of insane levels of political instrumentalization of Jewish identity, and in a context where people have a very shallow understanding of the way the world works generally, let alone an analysis of anti-Semitism. And you add on top of that, if we take the Golders Green attacks, for example, which were obviously horrific, but people are watching the police and the government totally erase the Muslim victim, who wasn't the third victim, he was the first victim of that attack. And we're watching them gaslight us about our experiences of racism. Of course, people will look at that and think, well, it must be the Jews. Must be the Jews doing all this. So we have to ask the question, why are the government, the police, and the media so invested in instrumentalizing Jewish identity? And I just want to make a really important caveat before summing up. What I'm not saying is that today's context is a blow-by-blow reenactment of historic or classical anti-Semitism. I'm not saying that. This is a very different post-Holocaust, post-1948 world. You know, the West, in a bid to rehabilitate its image after it refused Jewish refugees during the Holocaust, after it helped facilitate their mass slaughter, after the 1905 Aliens Act, which targeted Jews fleeing Russia and East Europe. After all of this, post-Holocaust, it tried to rehabilitate its image and reimagined itself as the protector of Jews. And not only this, there has been a fundamental shift in class dynamics post-Holocaust compared to the medieval period. Jews after the Holocaust were allowed to become fully fledged members of the ruling class that they were not allowed to be only 150 years ago. And this isn't dissimilar to how, for example, Black people were assimilated into the ruling class to blunt the radical edge of the civil rights movement. You know, states are able to assimilate those they hate or have previously hated to serve their interests or to stabilize a crisis. So it's co-optation, not liberation. And we cannot ignore the fact that many Jews, not all, and in some demographics, not most of them, particularly younger Jews, many Jews do feel invested in these processes of instrumentalization. So things are different today. It's not the exact same situation. But you can see the echoes and the continuities of classical anti-Semitism in how the state functionally uses and structurally positions Jews today. Not the same, but contiguous. So, for example, when ICE kidnapped Mahmoud Khalil, and then the White House tweeted out, "Shalom Mahmoud," we can surely see what is happening here in terms of how Jews are being positioned. And although that is obscured by Western philo-Semitism, we have to remember that philo-Semitism often is just anti-Semitism, and that the West is using Jewish identity as a symbol, as symbolic cover for its projects at home and abroad of state, capitalist, and imperial power. And that has the devastating effect of fomenting anti-Semitism from below. And I think the left has to be serious that anti-Semitism from below is on the rise. And you know, we can't deny that reality. So I guess to wrap up, how do we navigate this? How do we navigate both the rise in anti-Semitism from the state, the rise in anti-Semitism from below, and the moral panic around anti-Semitism. So I think the first thing is obviously principled solidarity, of course, is critical. Where anti-Semitism happens, we have to call it out. But we cannot do this by adopting wholesale the rigged frameworks of the establishment, who basically define anti-Semitism de facto as whatever the left does, whatever Muslims do, that's anti-Semitic. So we need our own analysis. And the left also needs to recognize that anti-Semitism is not just bad ideas in people's heads or acts of interpersonal violence, as important as it is that we call those things out. And the media would have you believe otherwise, because they hyper-focus on past tweets or dodgy Facebook posts, and that's what anti-Semitism is. We have to understand anti-Semitism as a function of power. It is structural, it's historic, it's systemic, it's politically mediated, and we have to call out the people who are driving those systems. So, alongside calling out far-right and religious anti-Semitism or online radicalization, and yes, also calling out anti-Semitism when it rears its head in our ranks, we have to call out Mark Rowley, we have to call out Keir Starmer, we have to call out Nigel Farage, Kemi Badenoch, as bartering in structural anti-Semitism. That's what they're doing. They are bartering in anti-Semitism. And the Greens will be sucked up and spit out if they play on the terrain of the moral panic laid out by those who seek to destroy what they're building. That was the mistake of Corbynism. We need to be against anti-Semitism, not just as a moral slogan or not just within the doctored frameworks of the establishment, but as a recognition of the historic interconnectedness between what happens with Jews and what happens to the rest of us. That is a structural analysis of anti-Semitism. So that's my hot take. The last thing I will say, I did debate in my head, should I mention this before my hot take? Should I mention this after my hot take? Should I mention it at all? And I decided to mention it after my hot take, which is that, the question of anti-Semitism can often be quite controversial on the left. And people often fear saying things about it for fear of being accused of being an anti-Semite. And I just want to let our audience know that for me, this isn't meaningless, this isn't just a theoretical question. My partner's Jewish, half my family's Jewish. We've got a mezuzah on our door. We do Shabbat virtually every Friday. We do all the high holidays. I go to shul a few times a year. So this is a meaningful question, not just for me, but a lot of people on the left. And I think we really have to take, this question super seriously. I would be really interested in your thoughts on how we learn the lessons of Corbynism and how the Greens learn those lessons, because that feels particularly pertinent.
Yeah. I mean, thanks for that, Shanice. That was just incredibly rich in substance. So thank you so much for that. I think it's worth working through a kind of order of things here a little bit, which is that the context that Joe set out in the news is really crucial for the kind of argument that Shanice has made in the hot take, right? Which is that the leadership of the two long-standing political parties right now fear they will lose their system, right? They fear they will lose control of the system that they have been so central to for the last century, right? Labour and the Conservatives, particularly Labour in this instance, actually. And it is Zach Polanski, the Green leader, the Jewish Green leader, who is currently facing the desperate wrath of them because of this fact, right? That needs to be a really central context here. There's a kind of separate context. No, it's not separate at all. There's another bit of context, which is that which kind of Shanice talked about, which is, as well as the kind of political assault on Polanski, there is this kind of question of the Palestine solidarity movement, right? How the kind of solidarity with Palestine kind of courses through the kind of veins of political life in Britain, how it kind of makes mincemeat of, or how it has made mincemeat of politicians who might otherwise engage in homilies about peace and international law, but who would be completely unwilling, or who were unwilling, to even countenance the idea of voting for a ceasefire in Parliament, right? So if we take it back a couple of years, a kind of basic question that millions of people asked themselves when they saw Labour cross that line over the question of genocide in Gaza: if these people could not stand up for a group of people facing one of the most violent air wars in human history, made and financed by the British state, how on earth could we trust them to represent the interests of us, their constituents, right? Really fundamental questions there. And we really should hone in on the Labour right in particular, right? Just as the Labour right were absolutely central to kind of Shanice's question, So the devastation of Corbynism as a kind of political project, a kind of politics that sets itself up as a kind of a bulwark against any genuine radical politics in this country. They're now seeking to wheel out this playbook against Corbyn and apply it to Polanski's Greens. I guess like there's a question of why, like the kind of central point made earlier by Shanice that Western strategic interests have made a great effort to kind of re-articulate some Jews in the state of Israel as a kind of outpost of Western civilization in the Arab world. That comes at great expense to Jewish communities across the world, right? It does not protect Jewish people, right? There's a central point of what you've argued there, Shanice. But it's like there's also this question of the British state's fundamental commitment to the state of Israel, right? Like from describing Israel as a loyal little Jewish Ulster early in the 20th century, reference there to the settler colonial project in the north of Ireland, to notions of Israel as a kind of guard dog of US interests in the Middle East. Those can't be understated. And I think to communicate a kind of radical politics that remotely questions British foreign policy is really anathema to this country's political class, and it's a really central context for what you've talked about, like the proliferation of anti-colonial politics since the commencement of the genocide, the expansion of that kind of way of thinking, that activism, of that organizing, of that kind of political consciousness has kind of shown these people that a kind of internationalist genie should be put back in the bottle. Polanski's kind of politics of Habibi, what are you doing, Habibi?
Oh, we have to leave this in.
So cute.
It's not cute at all.
I'm not sure if Habibi's agreeing or disagreeing with what you're saying.
Probably disagreeing. But so Polanski's articulation of those sentiments, right, and his kind of class politics, his questioning of NATO, however much some of us may think it doesn't go far enough necessarily, makes him to these people a kind of persona non grata. And I actually, as a sidebar, I'm really interested to see how some of this plays out in that kind of thing that I was talking about earlier in terms of the Greens' relationship to the Labour Party, if things change within the side of the Labour Party. So there's all of that, right? There's the kind of way in which because with moral panics, you really have to see them as like, I think Shanice is so right to say, the reason we talk about moral panics and not conspiracy, right, is that the moral panic grasps at things that have happened, not things that haven't happened, right? And I feel that has to be stressed, right? And it's like the energy of the moral panic comes through different kind of articulated moments and interests, right? Like part of the moral panic is that people want to continue the work that Suella Braverman couldn't really do, right? Suella Braverman wanted to face down the mass protests in 2023 that she called hate marches. She lost her job in no small part because of it. And today it's the Labour establishment that continues her legacy with enthusiasm, right? Whether it's charging Palestine actionists, people that organize Palestine solidarity demonstrations, whether it's kind of prescribing Palestine action. It's the Labour administration that outlaws protest and solidarity of Palestine in this country. So it's really important to think of a moral panic about anti-Semitism as finding a series of different social elements and state interests which constitute it. Someone who's thinking I'm quite indebted to here, a historian, Barnaby Raine, offers a bit of a prism through which to understand this as well, which is whereas historically Jews, like Shanice kind of alluded to, are mobilized as the kind of epitome of the racial other, right? Alien to Western civilization and its kind of cultural norms. Today they're upheld as the kind of outriders, or some Jews are upheld as the outriders of Western imperial interests, right? Kind of erected as a human shield by empire against opposition to capitalism, empire, settler colonialism. And, these narratives emboldened by the West's insistence against the wisdom of anti and non-Zionist Jews that Jewish people and the genocidal state of Israel are one and the same. And that just has to be one of the central features of arguments for any left in this moment, is prizing that apart. I think one of the things that Raine does, which really compels me, is how you grasp in moments of social crisis when languages and practices of anti-systemic politics have been eroded, but hostility to elites has ballooned, how states and state actors and elites hold Jews up as a shield to protect themselves, right? And of course, as the violence in Golders Green shows, as the recent anti-Semitic murders outside a synagogue in Manchester highlight, the acute mobilization of this moral panic only ever puts Jewish lives at greater harm. And it has to be one of the central insistencies of a left project. going forward. And to be fair, we can talk about some of the kind of clash between Polanski and Mark Rowley, right? And we can maybe talk about that. But that insistence is something that Zach Polanski does really well, and that I wouldn't fault him for, even if, we can raise questions about some of the more recent clashes and judgments around that.
Just to quickly come back, I think one of the things that I do struggle with this is it's taken us, and I think our analysis is absolutely spot on, right? And I think some of the work that's taken place in this area is absolutely spot on. Yet how do we convert this into a language?
For sure.
That makes sense to people? How do we convert this analysis into short, snappy slogans that says, do you know what the Met are doing is anti-Semitic, what Mark Rowley's doing is anti-Semitic, what Keir Starmer's doing is anti-Semitic? How do we communicate this reality to people, which is clouded and mystified and smokescreened, into something that is just easily accessible and tangible to your ordinary person? Because without that, that's how conspiracy theories flourish, right? When you have these complex systems and processes that are mystified and people are reaching for explanations and they're using their lived experience to try to make sense of things, and they're piecing things together, but there's lots of bits missing to the story. And in that space, conspiracy flourishes. And I think what we're doing here is really important, and barely anyone on the left is having this conversation. At the same time, the level that we're having it at is so deep and so rich. Actually, this will be really hard to communicate to people.
Although if anyone can do it, it's Zach. Both because of his communicative skills and also the fact that he's actually Jewish. So, if anyone can do it, it is Zach. And you should send him a DM, mate. You should talk to him.
He needs to listen to this section of the pod.
Yeah, I mean, I'll send it. I'll send it to his staff for sure. I will. Genuinely, I think they should. I think, look, Shanice, that was just wonderfully illuminating. I learned a lot. I also felt quite chuffed when you were talking about it, because I started to try and write something on this week, more from a tactical perspective, not a historical one at all. But I also landed on the distinction between moral panic and crisis as the kind of the foundational way of understanding it. It's, maybe this doesn't need to be said for listeners of this podcast, but whilst the Greens may have a political crisis with regards to anti-Semitism, in that and attacks around anti-Semitism on Zach and the party may be very difficult for their coalition to bear, and they may be a very good way of breaking it up, and they may be a very good way of toxifying the party and toxifying Zach. The party does not have an institutional crisis with regards to anti-Semitism. It is not the case that the Green Party is either, and I define it in two ways, either numerically has lots of anti-Semitic people within it, or anti-Semites are running the party or have control over the party in some way. I mean, just to reference, a couple of studies recently, YouGov polled in 2025 supporters of different parties on a range of indicators based on which were meant to imply as to whether people had anti-Semitic views but also anti-Zionist views. And unsurprisingly, supporters of the Green Party were way out there in terms of anti-Zionist views. They were a lot more anti-Zionist than any supporters of any other party. But they were far less anti-Semitic than Reform supporters, and about in line with Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives. If we jump back to 2017, the Jewish Policy Research and Community Security Trust did, a big old report looking at not political affiliation, but political views and preponderance of anti-Semitic attitudes and anti-Israel attitudes. Again, the left was consistently the most anti-Zionist, and with some anti-Zionist view on the right, actually, but the left was consistently the most anti-Zionist. But then with regards to anti-Semitism, it was the right who were the anti-Semitic ones, and in their words, the very left wing and the fairly left wing were completely in line with people of other political persuasions, apart from the far right, who were very, very out there. And to be honest, I think this shows a remarkable discipline amongst anti-Zionists. If you are against what the state of Israel is doing, and if you're against what they've done to the Palestinians, and you've been told time and time and time again that the Israeli state is Jewish people, and there is no distinction between those two things, and that's the propaganda that's been pushed on you. It's obviously going to make some people anti-Semitic, because they're going to be like, well, the state of Israel is all Jewish people. And yet, at least these two studies show that there's a remarkable discipline in there, and that many anti-Zionists just haven't fallen for that, and they can distinguish between the Israeli government, the actions of the Israeli government, and Jewish people and the actions of Jewish people. And that's just that's a really good thing and quite remarkable if you consider the context. On the other side, you know, it really is quite damning of, say, you know, the Board of Deputies and other right-wing Jewish community organizations' tolerance of the far right in this country, you know, and there's a tolerance of them because they are more Zionist and more supportive of the Zionist project for the reasons that Shanice and Jonas have outlined. You know, they're seen as the kind of outpost of, you know, like Western imperial interest in the Middle East, and almost like for some great replacement theorists and people, like a barrier to hordes of Muslims coming in and taking over the West. But these people are super anti-Semitic and really racist towards Jewish people. And that's just tolerated because of the geopolitics. Yeah, it's just tolerated because of the geopolitics. So I just thought that was important to establish that, like, there is no institutional crisis inside the Green Party, as much as the press may want to talk about that. I think one thing that maybe does happen, though, you guys can dispute this if you want, but I think one thing that maybe does happen is that although anti-Semitic attitudes are not any more common in the Green Party than they would be in any other party, I think because the issue of Israel-Palestine is discussed a lot, because it's one of the main things that, you know, we campaign on, and it's a really important thing, it just means that when some people do have those views, they are more noticeable because the subject is talked about. I think if you're going to go interview loads of Labour or Lib Dem members, you'd find loads of anti-Semitism, but they just don't talk about it that much because there's not much salience of the issue in the party. So I think that maybe is a reality sometimes, and it doesn't mean there's an institutional crisis in the Green Party. There isn't. It's just a dynamic of, like, issue salience and what people are talking about and not talking about. I think with regards to how you approach this stuff in the media, it's incredibly difficult. Like, I'm sorry, not just approach it in the media, but how do you try and fight this stuff off in general as a left project? I think there's obviously one camp, which I don't want to parody, but I would try and describe as the kind of, like, no apologies, no surrender camp. And often Mélenchon and Sanders, I think, are two of the people that are cited as the best proponents of this. And I think the logic of this is, like, never apologize. So it's like Corbyn apologized too much. It wasn't always that he said sorry, but he also adopted an apologetic posture, if that makes sense. Like, he seemed sorry and apologetic for himself and his party. And this just invited press attacks. And it just meant that they realized there was a weakness there, and they'd go for him. And what you actually need to do is you need to be combative at all points. You need to be confident at all points. And if people libel you, you need to sue them. You know, you need to do stuff like that. And then I think there's another camp where on the other end, which is a lot more kind of oriented around respectability, and is a lot more conscious with the idea that if the Green Party are going to become a majoritarian party, they're going to have to attract, part of that coalition will be, you know, big house, liberal, Guardian reading voters who pay attention to politics a lot. They will have noticed that there's an anti-Semitism crisis. They, you know, from a distance, probably from their nice houses, care about minorities and want to, you know, wouldn't want to be associated with prejudice or anything that was, like, negative towards minorities. And thus, you know, having this issue come up and again and again and again toxifies for this certain set of voters. And I think there is some evidence to show that this is the case. And their approach, I think, is to be quite condemning with regards to any racism. So there's the whole line of, like, if there is anti-Semitism, it must be gotten rid of. And also quite, I think, like, procedural about it often. Like, I'm focused on, like, we need better processes and blah, 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 blah. And I think I'll land somewhere in between, but I really emphasize, I think, because I don't think anyone really knows, like, properly how to deal with this. I think the thing that the no surrender people have got correct is that I think adopting an apologetic posture nationally and basically ceding ground to the fact that there is this massive crisis in the party when there isn't, does invite loads more attacks. I think it's very true. I think the thing that they get wrong is that if you're always combative, you're going to be raising the salience of issues that you don't want to be raising the salience of. I'm all up for combative politics, but I want to be combative on issues such as drinking in Parliament that send, you know, like, the establishment into a fucking spin and make Hannah look like a very normal person. Or I want to be combative about, like, you know, like BP's oil or, like, war profits in Iran. Or I want to be combative around I don't know, like renaming the Ministry of Defence the Ministry of Peace and Security, which was in the last Green Manifesto, or you know what I mean? Like I want to be combative around issues where I think we're going to get a majority support and where we're going to end up on the side of the people rather than the side of the establishment. And I'm not really sure anti-Semitism is the thing that I want to be raising the salience of. So that's where I disagree with those guys. I think where I disagree with the kind of the moderators on the other side is that they assume the toxification is like the death knell for the project, and I'm just not sure. I don't know. Like I'm just not sure how important it is. I buy that taking up airtime with these kind of conversations is really bad, and if Zach is having to defend all the time on national media and he's not going to talk about the issues that you want to talk about, that's obviously bad. How much people vote based on this, I'm not sure. We obviously saw a dip in Zach's popularity in some polls, but really that could be down to him taking a relatively unpopular position on police action in the wake of terrorism, not an anti-Semitism, you know? And although they were kind of combined in the minds of voters, they were also separate issues. So I don't think we can just say, ooh, anti-Semitism has toxified the party in this irrevocable way. And I think the other problem that I have with people on that side as well is that they don't quite want to grapple with some of just the difficulties of mass politics, where they're like, you know, I think there's a part of them would rather manage the party down to nothing and not have this mass member party where you have lots of people saying and doing things and sometimes they don't say the right thing. And I think that, you know, some people on that side will say, well, why don't we just have the better vetting processes? So if you tried to vet 2,000 candidates or 4,000 candidates, like have you thought about what it would mean to logistically vet 4,000 people in a deep way? Like we do need to think about that, but I think we need to accept that it's an incredibly hard thing to do. And mass movements are unruly and move in lots of different directions. You know, this is the place that I get stuck in. And I think there are some simple tactics that Zach isn't doing at the moment that he really should be doing. Zoran Mamdani always had a policy he could reach for to show that he was going to make Jewish New Yorkers safer. It was an 800% increase in the budget for the hate crimes unit in New York. The Green Party really should have something similar that they could reach to. You know, like I kind of buy into the Mamdani thing too, around trying to use more universal language of human rights when talking about Israel-Palestine, just because it seems to land quite well with liberal audiences, and maybe that is a compromise that you have to make when you're part of a majoritarian project. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend I have all of the answers to this stuff, because I just really don't. Oh, my final thing that I would say though, and it'll be controversial, so it's worth saying, is that I do think I've talked a lot about what Zach should do, but I do just think there is a question for the membership of the Green Party too. And I know I've said this before, but I will say it again. Like I think discipline is important. I think discipline around trying to polarize around issues we want to talk about and not raise the salience of issues we don't want to talk about. I don't think we want to be stuck talking about anti-Semitism all the time. And I do think pushing motions like Zionism and racism inside the party does just add to that polarization and give the press an excuse.
That motion so much.
I do. But look, and the reason I mention it is not because it came up at Spring Conference, but it will come up at Summer Conference again. It will come up again, so it is still a live issue. And I just think that gives the press it gives them an excuse to come at us about this stuff. I don't think we want to give them any excuse.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I find tricky about the binary between the no apology, no surrender people and the respectability people is, I mean, first of all, I probably find myself much closer to the no apology, no surrender side. But it positions the question fundamentally about sensibilities, about communication strategy, about how you posture in the media, and it forgets the question of power, right? So if you look at the context in the US, the mainstream media no longer have this stranglehold over the political establishment and over the electorate in the way that it used to. It's not as influential as it used to be. And that's because the right have been, I mean, just incredibly genius at building ecosystems of media and information, to the extent where single podcasters like Joe Rogan have hegemony over the media establishment, and CNN no longer do. And I don't want anyone to confuse what I'm saying. I'm not saying the typical line, we just need our own Joe Rogans. I don't think it's as simplistic or as reductive as that. But media shitstorms in the US just don't have the same impact as they do in Britain, for example. And I think Zoran Mamdani learnt from that as well. He's been creating his own ecosystem of media and propaganda to great effect. And I think Zach has tried to learn from some of that. He's launched his Bold Politics. He's been doing those incredibly beautifully put together videos, and they've been deeply popular. But I think there's something there about the question of power. Like, how do we create our own institutions of influence that mean actually, what goes on in the mainstream media just doesn't really matter that much anymore? And I think, there's a question there. There's a question of power there for me. Back in the day, we used to have our own newspapers circling. I think of the West Indian Gazette by Claudia Jones that had a readership of thousands. And we just don't have that ecosystem of information anymore, to our detriment. But specifically on that binary between no apology, no surrender and respectability, I do think we have to say that Zach Polanski's apology to Mark Rowley was really wrong-headed. Not because it related in any way to the question of anti-Semitism. I thought the things that he was saying on anti-Semitism was spot on. But how that apology came about was Zach Polanski retweeted something that was mildly questioning and challenging of police behaviour. Mark Rowley then, a week before an election, wrote a public letter before trying any kind of private communications, made a political intervention to call out Zach Polanski. And I think the apology just gave consent to the idea that there's something wrong with critiquing police action, and police, critiquing the police isn't warranted. And I think it ceded way too much ground, particularly in a context where, if you're looking at the kind of actual specificities of the event, I'm going to caveat this by saying I'm not an expert, but I have been doing a little bit of digging on kind of police advice to their own officers when they taser someone. When you taser someone, they have no muscular control, right? They lose all ability to control their muscles. And police are told that in that circumstance of someone being immobilized, the kinds of levels of force that you use should be moderated. That's how they're trained. And in that video, you've got the attacker lying on the ground, tasered, holding the knife in his hand. And the justification that kind of Mark Rowley gives is, he's got a knife, you don't know what's in the backpack. The guy's immobilized, he can't drop the knife. And he's being battered in the head, bashed multiple times in the head while tasered. That's against the police's own protocols, let alone moral or ethical sensibilities. And so to then apologize for just making the correct question, just asking the question of whether that was acceptable, I think ceded too much ground politically on the question of policing. And I think the final thing I would say is that racism exists, sexism exists, homophobia exists, transphobia exists. These things exist in society. You scratch a political party and you will find an anti-Semite, you will find a sexist, you will find a homophobe. Political parties should be spaces where people can come together, hash out ideas, learn, meet new people. The chaos of everyday life should be allowed within political parties, and the Greens need to not be defensive about that or shamed into that. The idea that we don't want any anti-Semites in our party, well, then you don't want a mass party, frankly. You don't want mass politics. And I think, it's the leadership. And I think Lenin said this even. I could be making it up.
What did Lenin say?
But he made a distinction between the anti-Semitism of the workers' councils and the anti-Semitism within leadership, and that actually there was a distinction between these two parts of the party. We need to make sure our leaders are hot on these questions. There can be no anti-Semitism in leadership. We've got to have the correct line. We've got to be spot on. We've got to have a solid analysis. When it comes to membership, we just talk about ordinary people whose ideas are chaotic, whose understanding of the world, is shallow or complex or contradictory. And we have to have room for growth. We have to have room for learning. And we have to have room for just the messy reality that people think different things at different points in their lives. That's all of us. None of us are morally squeaky clean. None of us have always had perfect ideas. Some of us still don't have perfect ideas. None of us do. And that's just the reality of politics.
Yeah, and that's, to be honest, that's the same dynamic that we were referencing when we were way back 6 months ago in another world, in another life,
Yeah.
we were talking about your party and
What's that?
and Zara Sultana. Yeah, what's that? What's your party?
Who?
And what a stupid name for a party. And Zara's, and you know, like Zara's approach to, I can't remember what they were called. What were they called now? The Independent MPs, the Independent Alliance. There you go. Wow, such a throwback. And Zara's approach to the Independent Alliance, and you know, her kind of position, her like very hard position on trans rights, and you know, her basic implication that no one in the party could have a position that was anything but hers. And I think we made the same distinction where we were like, well, yeah, I think that, like, you know, the point is that the leadership needs to be further ahead. Like, we can't be having like transphobe landlord leaders, but you can have transphobic landlord members and supporters who can go on a journey and who can learn and who can change.
Yeah.
You know, like that is totally a thing. I think on the because I obviously want to talk about the apology and the Mark Rowley apology. I'm going to give the counter argument for this. I don't know where I think this. I think the counter argument for the apology is that they were very worried about getting into a massive argument with the Met Police chief a week before the elections, what they felt from a position that was just like very unpopular, even within the membership, never mind like everyone that was going to vote for them. And I think and whether you think that's right or wrong, I don't know, but I think that was their position, is that they wanted to calm that down as much as possible so they could move it on to other things by the time of the election, which arguably that happened.
Yeah, but are we doing bold politics or are we doing scared politics? Make up your mind.
No, and that's a really good point. And I think but Shanice, I think we're doing both. And I think it's because, so we often talk about the role of different organizations within the movement ecology, right? And we kind of accept that parties are never going to make as much ground and push the Overton window as far as activists and movement groups are going to, because at the end of the day, they've got to win votes, and like winning votes has a triangulating logic to it. Like, as much as we don't want to say it does, it just does at the end of the day, right? And I think the point there is actually, like, at that moment, the Green Party and Zach and the leadership were in a very triangulating position because they were a week out from an election. I think that if there weren't local elections a week later, they may well have made a different decision. I don't know that, but I think they may well have made a different decision, and they may well have not apologized and pushed that argument a bit further. And it is an interesting example of that movement ecology at play, but almost like within one organization, and showing how like the priorities and incentives and then actions of an organization or a leadership can change because of the proximity of something like an election.
Yeah, I mean, it should just be worth saying that, like, I mean, like, Labour released all these big scaremongering dossiers, right, in the kind of run up to the local election, right? And you know, there were absolutely some genuine examples of anti-Semitism in those, and that should be dealt with and challenged and reckoned with. But there all were also just loads of legitimate criticisms, sometimes really cack-handedly articulated, of the state of Israel, right? Amongst some of them are like the candidates who supported the proscription of the Israeli Defense Forces. I mean, just seems totally legitimate to me. Someone who endorsed punk rap duo Bob Vylan's Death to the IDF chant at Glastonbury, again, totally legitimate to me. And then advocating Hamas's removal from Britain's terror group list. I don't have a problem with that. You know, and you may not share these political sensibilities, right? But the claim that they constitute anti-Semitism rather than an earned hostility to the genocidal state of Israel and its institutions is obviously just wrong, right? So it is worth just saying that, right? There's a big question for me here about about populism, actually, that I think is quite central to some of this stuff. If we think about the proceduralists in kind of Joe's heuristic, which I quite like, you can't be a populist really and be a proceduralist at the same time, right? You can't have a kind of populist invocation and talk about the need to manage things in the party and be very serious. I think I think you get into trouble right there, as well as all the other kind of political problems that both of you have outlined with that kind of way of thinking about this matter. I think with the others, the kind of no surrender crew, which are, like Shanice, is definitely the group of people that I'm much closer to. It depends who it is, right? I think it's much easier for Sanders to do that because his actual position on Palestine and Israel is much more tame, really. Like, that needs to be said, right? And with Mélenchon, it's interesting because there is no don't surrender But he's also a fantastic politician at re-articulating the terms of the conversation, right? And he's also, and this is a really fundamental to the question for me, he's also someone whose politics have changed quite a bit over the past decade, right? Because I think, capitalism is an impersonal system of domination, right? But the way in which people articulate their hostility to the system in the contemporary world is often quite personal, right? It's often through personalized figures of elites, which lends itself to a kind of pessimistic, zero-sum, often anti-Semitic thinking, right? And we have to be honest about that. And I think that presents tensions within populism, because so much of populism is anti-elitism. It's identifying antagonisms with particular groups of individuals or particular individuals, because it is just, frankly, much easier to do that than it is to kind of speak in broader abstract terms about the system at large, right? And I think part of the issue is that an emancipatory language of politics that's against the system at large, that's anti-capitalist, has been lost over the course of the last 40 years. And so it makes this kind of question more pronounced. I do think a kind of left populism can do that work that kind of blends that anti-elitism with a structural critique of capitalism. But it's a real tension, right, between a kind of critique of an impersonal system of domination and a personalized one, with like populism being the arena in which you do those, is profoundly difficult in our kind of highly mediated attention economy world. And that's a big question for the left. And then for me, there's this question, where do I land on in terms of the framing? Like, what should be the framing? And this brings me back to that question of like, where's the emancipatory critique of capitalism, if you like? And I'm not saying necessarily that the Greens are going to do this. Like that's kind of something that has to be worked through and fought over. It's not automatic. But I kind of settle on we have to speak about self-determination again, right? Like both self-determination for the Palestinian people and framing it through that lens, the question, rather than simply the question of Israel and its horrible leaders. But we also have to relate that to the question of a good life and security for Jews who all live around the world, right? Security, not in that kind of paranoid, regressive sense, but in a kind of sense that people just want to live secure, good lives. And we have to be able to articulate that and connect it with the fact that the whole project of the left is we want everyone to have self-determination over their lives, right? And that has to be fundamental to the way we start to re-articulate things, in my opinion.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay. Thanks so much for that rich conversation, comrades. You've had it all here today, a kind of breakdown of the local elections, a kind of rich, insightful history of anti-Semitism, little vignettes about the popular rebellion in the 1920s. It's all been here today. Finally, to round out and say goodbye, what should everybody else be reading or listening to this week? Shanice.
So I'm going to suggest people take a look at Abraham Leon's The Jewish Question.
Wow.
Abraham Leon was a Jewish Marxist, and specifically a Trotskyist, actually, and he did a lot of underground propagandizing and did some brilliant media work, kind of at really difficult times to organize communist and Marxist politics. And he ended up being murdered, in fact, during the Holocaust by Nazi Germany. But he wrote a really brilliant history of Jewish classed life, and I guess a analysis of the material and structural roots of anti-Semitism. And for me, The Jewish Question is a really class A example of Marxist historical analysis. There are two really, I think, important critiques of the book. Number one, it ignores Eastern Europe. And number two, it can be quite deterministic. So the position of Jews in Eastern Europe and Western Europe was really different. And his book can sometimes make really sweeping deterministic generalizations from the class position of Jews to, therefore, what Jews might have thought of that at that time or why anti-Semitism existed. But if you want a really solid material history of Jewish life in Western Europe, Jewish class life, the relationship to the monarchy, economy, etc., then Abraham Leon's The Jewish Question is a really brilliant place to start.
Amazing. What do you have for us, Joe?
I've just been really focused on local council stuff, to be honest. So I am going to give you the Haringey and Hackney Green Party manifestos, which genuinely they're worth reading because, this is going to be the left, or, you know, like the soft left in power, and they're going to try and do some of this stuff, and it's going to be very interesting. And then as an addendum to that, I would say the work that the Abundance think tank has been doing on popular asset commissions, which, you know, is written in quite a technical voice, I would say, but is some of the more forward-thinking transitional work around what can cash-strapped councils do to both, I think, like, tell a story about how they got there in terms of, yes, central government cuts, but also private companies basically, you know, like, creaming off profit from council budgets through public-private partnerships, and also what popular structures that can be set up to try and change that and change people's relationship to the council and the state locally. So yeah, they'd be mine for this week.
Amazing. For me, it's a book that's recently come out, authored by Callum Cant and Matthew Lee, The Future in Our Past.
Oh, is it good? I haven't read it yet. Is it good?
It's really, really good. It's a banger. It's about the 1926 general strike. It's a kind of centenary account. It's a kind of great place to begin if you don't really know much about the general strike, and if you do know a bit, it's still really brilliant, and it's really great in terms of breaking down some of the strategic tensions within the British labour movement in a kind of quite convulsive time. It's also just like super exciting as a book. Like when a book's just got that really lovely pacing, and you like really feel that like you're kind of on the march with those historical events that are being like detailed. It's like really wonderful for that. It really breaks down the stakes of the general strike, the different interests at play. And what I really love about it actually is that each chapter ends with a vignette. So it takes the reader to the present day, posing the question of how classes lived in the same places documented about the general strike, but today, you know. So I think it's Swindon, South Wales, and I can't remember the other place now. But it's really, really great, and I really, really recommend it. It's a beautiful book. That's it until next time, folks. Thanks to all our supporters. Thanks to all of our listeners. We'll include all those links in the show notes. In the meantime, find us on Instagram at life.withtheparty, Twitter on life.partypod. Leave your comments, Apple, Spotify, and yeah, we're out.
Bye.
This is an Ampersounds production.